Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're joining us from today. My name is Stephanie Waller, and I am the Program Director of Grantmakers for Education. On behalf of our Executive Director, Nicole Rodriguez-Leach, and our entire team at EdFunders, we just want to welcome you and thank you so much for joining us for this afternoon's webinar entitled Unlocking Grantee Potential Through Capacity Building. We have really a star-studded lineup of speakers and panelists today, so we're really excited to jump into the conversation today. I want to just quickly thank Lucy, Jen, Dhivya, and Sherman for joining us, and thank you to Leona Christie, CEO and founder of Catalyst Ed, for serving as our moderator for today's session. So without further ado, I will kick it over to Leona to get us started.
Thank you, Stephanie. It is so exciting to be here. And like Jen said, so great to see so many familiar faces and friends here in our attendee list and people from all over. So welcome again to this conversation. We're really hoping it's going to be a fun and thought-provoking conversation. And if you guys were here in our 15-minute of prep that we did just before this call, you would have got a sense of how this group here is buzzing with ideas, thoughts, so much to offer. So before I introduce the panelists and we get started off, I wanted to first invite all of you to go ahead and enter in something into chat, because here's the important thing. We want all of you to join into this conversation. So throughout, please add any comments or questions either into chat or into the Q&A box. And we do have this Q&A time set aside at the end of this conversation. But if we don't get to them right away, we'll do that right at the end. So just to get those chat muscles going, we're going to do one of those waterfall responses. So I want you to put in what one thing you're hoping to get from this conversation. Type it in, but don't hit enter just yet. So type in what's one thing you're hoping to get from this conversation. Right? Ideas, inspirations, insights into the organizational capacity needs of small education organizations, varying perspectives. I'm really hoping we can put some varying perspectives in here. I know while we're all values aligned, we're all doing things somewhat differently. So I'm hoping there'll be some interesting conversation there. Deborah, insights about the tension between asking grantees about what help they need and their desire to not appear vulnerable. That's a really big one. So we'll get to that. And then considerations for leveraging companies for capacity building for corporate philanthropy. I don't know that we had planned to talk about that, Eva, but let's see. This conversation could go in all kinds of directions. So before we get started, I wanted to take a quick minute to introduce myself. Like Stephanie mentioned, I am Leona Christie, the founder and CEO of Catalyst Ed. We're a national nonprofit that helps leaders and teams essentially navigate the capacity building ecosystem and figure out what solutions, providers, and resources are the right fit for them. So excited to be in this conversation. We also fund capacity building projects for proximate organizations. So, really familiar with many of these tussles that all of you as funders face as you think about how best to support organizations in both getting the help they need, while at the same time not being overly prescriptive. So here today, we are going to talk about capacity building and how do we unlock it to benefit the organizations we work with. Now, capacity building itself has been in the news. So if you've been following these articles, there's been everything from should we cancel capacity building to folks who are talking about how capacity building can be a tool for transformation. And so somewhere in that tension, that's the conversation we're going to have to be, right? Like, how do we think about, is it about canceling capacity building, or is it about reframing it completely and leveraging it so that it is having the most impact where it's needed, right? Now, funders are just one stakeholder in the whole ecosystem of capacity building, but they are an important stakeholder because they fund those projects. And as a result, they exert this gravitational pull on what kinds of projects get funded and what don't. And so slowly, we're seeing funders shift their practices. And many of the funders you're seeing here on this panel are doing that, have been pushing for that. And we are seeing the impact of that on the field as well. So I am excited to introduce our panelists. And so we are going to ask each of them to get started by introducing themselves and very succinctly answering two questions. What's bringing you to this conversation? And from your perspective, what's a common myth or misunderstanding about capacity building that you'd like to debunk? So we're going to do this in reverse alphabetical order. So Sherman, I'm going to call on you first.
Good afternoon, everyone. What brings me to this space? I have been a funder since 2011 and large institutional foundations, and currently am an advisor, strategic advisor to both funders and intermediaries. And I'm sorry, what's the second question?
This is your question, Sherman. What's a myth you'd like to debunk?
Oh, the myth.
So many myths that you'd like to debunk, right?
Sorry, I'm starting off already. I shouldn't have topped off my bourbon. The myth I'd like to debunk is that there's very limited dollars, very limited financial support for capacity building in the philanthropic sector. I think that's an artificial narrative that we need to talk about.
All right. Next, I'm going to ask Dhivya.
Hi, all. I'm Dhivya Venkataraman. I am with the Schusterman Family Philanthropies, and I lead our work on grantee capacity support. Just a little bit too, just if it's okay, Leon, I'll say that our approach, because this will inform kind of my responses to other questions, our approach to grant making here is to provide multi-year unrestricted operating grants to our grantees. And I'll say that we also understand that organizational impact requires more than just a grant to create and support organizational effectiveness and honestly resilience to have long-term impact. So we provide, and we have a long-standing history of providing beyond what we call beyond the grant resources. And this is things that any resource that builds and strengthens systems, structures, cultures, skills, knowledge, like all the things that go into an organization serving their communities. And for us, this looks like technical assistance support. We do a lot of convenings and cohort experiences, programming, and probably most regularly, just general thought partnership with our grantees, during our regular check-ins. So I just wanted to give that primer. And what brings me to this conversation is just, I want to understand and learn about how we can leverage these opportunities to better support impactful work. And so share our perspective while also learning from my fellow panelists on how they approach these things. And then the myth to debunk, I'd say, is that capacity building is a linear process that is prescribed to the grantees, when in actuality, it's a lot more collaborative. Thank you.
All right, Leona, you want me to take the mic? Okay, I think I can do reverse alphabet. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Husbands. I'm a senior program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where I've been since 2018. I have kind of a unique role. In addition to holding grants, I lead the community of practice for our Networks for School Improvement, which is a large strategy that we began in 2018. And so capacity building is on my mind very much as I work with this network of grantees. I would say what brings me to this conversation is, I spent the majority of my career on the other side of the table. This is my first foray into philanthropy. And so I felt as someone running a small nonprofit that capacity building was either ignored or sort of not done very well. So this is something that, has been near and dear to me since I joined the team at the foundation, and certainly is relevant to my role. I would say a myth that I hope that we debunk here is that, this myth that there's only a small number of organizations that can provide capacity building support. In our work, we've seen that is, definitely not the case, but I still feel like that myth persists, that you have to kind of anoint these 2 or 3 orgs to take care of all the needs. And I hope that we're moving past that. So that's me. I'll pass it to Lucy.
Thanks, everyone. I'm very, very excited to engage in this conversation with my fellow panelists and just to hear some questions and responses from the audience as well. My name is Lucy Brainard. I am the manager of portfolio success and operations at the Overdeck Family Foundation, which in layman's terms means I manage all of our capacity building supports for the organization. Overdeck Family Foundation, for those who don't know, is a family foundation that aims to open doors for every child in the U.S. by measurably enhancing education both inside and outside of the classroom. Our vision for this work is to provide all children with the opportunity to unlock their potential. We offer strategic capacity building support in addition to general operating support for all eligible grantees through a tiered model that uses both internal and external expertise. By focus on building these trusting and transformational relationships with our grantees, we collaborate with them to identify organizational gaps and strengths, which then help to inform responsive, action-oriented engagements that we hope in aggregate are the catalyst for accelerating the scale of cost-effective impact. For this conversation especially, I'm hoping that we can all coalesce on some of these best practices for capacity building to better support all of our grantees in a more holistic way, knowing that we're all taking different approaches and a lot of us have overlapping grantees as well. And I'm also hoping to use this conversation to debunk this myth that trust-based philanthropy and strategic capacity building are at odds with each other. Thank you, and I'll pass it back to Liana.
Thank you. And so I'm going to invite the audience, if any of these myths resonated with you, or you have specific thoughts or reflections emerging from them, just go ahead and put in a thought or reflection into chat. Like I said, we want this to be a conversation as much as possible. All right, so before we get into the meat of our conversation, I wanted to take a minute to share a couple of definitions of capacity building, while acknowledging that there is a fair amount of debate in the field right now on whether capacity building is even the right term, right? So there are folks who are like, should it be capacity strengthening? Should it be around organizational development? So there is that larger conversation that's happening, but for now, for the purpose of this conversation, we'll just use the term capacity building in a very encompassing way, okay? And I'm going to share this definition, which is derived from the work of Nishimura et al. And we'll share a list of resources with you at the end of this conversation. And you'll see this article as part of those resources. So this definition of capacity building sees it as the process of working with organizations to build, strengthen, and augment the skills, knowledge, systems, structures, culture, resources, and power they need to serve students, families, and communities, right? And what I love about this is, first of all, this acknowledgement that it is about working with organizations rather than something that's done to organizations. I love how it looks at capacity building in this very holistic way, right? So it's not just about skills and knowledge, but it's also about things like culture and power, right? And the purpose of it is to serve students, families, and communities. We also see that sometimes capacity building can be about supporting organizations through a specific situation. It can be about building capacity in an area. So maybe we want to get better at data-driven instruction, for instance, right? Or it can be about full-on organizational transformation, right? So just wanted you all to keep these definitions in mind, or this kind of starting point for the rest of our conversation. All right, we'll stop sharing, and it's back to our panelists. Well, Dhivya, in your introduction, you talked about resilience as something that you think of as very important. Can you talk a little bit more about, what do you mean by resilience, and how does it fit into this whole, idea of capacity building?
Yeah, thank you. I'll say, so in Schusterman, we think about our investments and we try to support organizations that are attempting to address systemic issues, systemic change. And so when we say addressing systemic change, it has to be long-term. There are no short-term solutions to making those changes. And so what that means is organizations have to be able to sustain their impact in the long term. And that's really kind of the crux of resilience. There's probably a more technical definition, but it's really what we're talking about when we say we want these organizations to be able to weather changes in environments, weather changes in policy conditions, whether a pandemic, whether a different, in our case now, like the conversations happening around book banning and CRT, like how do we help have organizations stay true to their mission while also building resiliency strength to kind of address things that are changing all around them that are outside of their control. And then also a third element of resilience is also being adaptive and responsive. So that's a little bit of how we see it. And it's all with the idea of longer term sustainable impact for these organizations that then lead to the change we seek to see.
What's really interesting to me about what you shared there is is that definition, in a sense, recognizes that organizations don't live in this kind of sealed silo, but they're part of an ecosystem. And in interacting with that ecosystem, they're also vulnerable to all kinds of things that happen, right? So you need to build that capacity to be resilient there.
Yeah, and you know, one thing I'll add to, just to be reflective of ourselves, that includes also changes in funder trends. So how are you managing through that? Because if we're being honest with ourselves, those change, and that's not a static, you know, stable thing as well.
You know, one of the things we talked about is capacities, right? And so I'm curious to hear thoughts on, are some capacities more important than others? Jen, I'm going to pick on you on this one. What's your thought?
Well, I think one of the biggest learnings that came out of the capacity building work that we've been doing with the Networks for School Improvement is that we had we kind of articulated what the key capacities were that we felt were important for them to do the work. They were aligned to the same criteria we used for grantee selection. And so they participated in a self-assessment process. And then they kind of helped to determine which of the areas was most important. So I guess my reaction to that question is like, I don't think it's our job necessarily to decide which capacities are most important. I think that part of this sort of newer approach to capacity building that we're all trying to kind of seed and grow is more about engaging with grantees and giving them voice and choice in how they determine what capacities to focus on. So that's kind of my reaction.
John, I'd love to build on some of the points that you brought in there. I think especially around, we're similar in this idea that the initial key capacities that we focus on are similar to the ones that are aligned to the selection process, our selection process in general, and not most important, not which ones are the most important, but what are the ones that we as a funder may be best positioned to offer support in. And so for us at Overdeck Family Foundation, we really see our purpose as working with these nonprofit partners to co-create opportunities for their organizations to leverage these strategic supports to help them accelerate their achievement of their goals. And we, of course, want to help these organizations build their internal capacities so that they can be more self-sufficient and sustainable in the long term. But I think where we see too is that we want to work with grantees to narrow in on the root cause of an issue, not just the symptoms that they're seeing. And for us, we really try to ensure that organizations have a strong foundation that sets them up for catalytic growth and scale. So while there are no most important capacities, we do believe that there are certain capacities that are important foundational pieces that will help grantees achieve that goal of cost-effective and sustainable scale that we have for our grantees. And so where that comes up, especially for us, is our technical assistance supports are focused on leadership development, financial planning, revenue models, impact evaluation, and strategic growth market demand, as we believe that these supports will help remove those barriers to achieving cost-effective and sustainable scale.
Yeah, something that you said, Lucy, made me think about also when we had a portfolio of grantees coming in, they had different strengths and areas for growth. So what might have been important to one was not necessarily important to another because they all had these different kind of constellations. So I think that's another reason why it's sort of like not necessarily we might articulate a set of areas and then work with them to decide which ones to focus on, but not to say this one's the most important because they all have different skills that they're bringing to the table.
The other thing that's coming up for me is, Lucy, you mentioned foundational skills, and it also makes me wonder whether the stage of the organization makes a difference, right? So I know a little bit about both Overdeck's grantees as well as Jen, your grantees, and the profile of the organizations is very different. And so you can imagine that there are some things which might be more relevant for earlier stage grantees, smaller grantees, than they are for larger, well-established ones. So Sherman, I see you nodding along. Do you have a specific thought there?
See, you get picked on when you nod. I think from the lens of the consumer, i.e. the nonprofit education leader, I think that they're looking for a robust ecosystem of supports from philanthropy in particular, right? I think that first and foremost, multi-year general ops funding is what success looks like in capacity building. But it's also it's not just the money. It's a variety of other things. It's strategic advising combined with a little bit of technical assistance. It's executive coaching when needed. It's investing in intermediaries who might walk along slowly with some patient capital, slow walking with an organization to help them, whether they be in the startup phase or whether they be in what the VCs call the valley of death phase, right? And a lot of our organizations, I've spent a lot of years with you, Leona, included, but I've spent a lot of years working with organizations led by leaders of color. And when they get to that valley of death phase, that year 3 to year 5, and they're no longer the shiny penny, but they're also not well equipped to be sustainable for the long term, that's actually when they need the most capacity building. So I was nodding because I was thinking about all the groups that you and I have worked with in that year 3 to 5. They're no longer startup. They're doing pretty good. They're doing great work, but they just don't have enough money and or other supports to help them get to that next level of sustainability.
Yeah, so I'm hearing this idea of an array of supports, right, which are probably held primarily by large multi-year unrestricted funding, which I think is always really helpful. Give leaders the money is always the starting point here, but then supporting that with an array of supports. And what I'm seeing emerge here is already some conversation around what considerations might drive which are the right supports to offer, right? So stage of organization. Lucy, you also talked about what the foundation's own capabilities and capacities might be. Jen, you talked about organizational priorities. Is there anything else that feels missing here as we think about, what might be the factors or considerations that might lead organizations to benefit more from support in one area over others?
I'm going to jump in here because that's this thought that comes to me, maybe not exactly about one support over another, but something we're often in conversation with is readiness to do the capacity building work. So it's ridiculous, but it's, do you have the capacity to capacity build? And it's true, because really, oftentimes when you're partnering, to develop a strong set of tailored solutions requires significant staff and leader time. So it's not the immediate surge of bandwidth that you hope for or you expect. So there's some realities of, is this, like, how urgent is this work? What is your current foundation, your current capacity to take this on? What are your other priorities? And if it's not time, what are we doing in the interim to support you to figure out when it is the right time and to make sure that you're okay during the time in which you're waiting? And so readiness to me is something that needs to be taken into consideration when figuring out like, what are the right supports? And maybe the response to readiness is, let's do a small short-term project or a small kind of quick thing, and then come back to it later and do a longer term approach. And the area in this that we try to manage towards is, I know, like, being on the nonprofit side, the minute a funder says there is some dollars available for capacity building, you want to jump on it. You want to take it immediately for fear that it won't be available later on. And so how do we have conversations where we're actually saying, no, this is okay. We want you to be ready. We'll, Sherman, I love patient capital. Like, we're patient. We're here for you in the long run on this journey with you. Let's talk about your readiness and then determine what are the right needs related to your readiness.
Yeah, I love that. And I love this whole idea of on-ramps towards larger capacity building projects, right? And I think one of the other things that often determines readiness is whether you have some of the ingredients necessary for the project itself to be successful. So that could look like buy-in from board and stakeholders. It could look like availability of data. We often see folks who come in ready to do an evaluation project, and we're like, hold, you're not ready for a full evaluation project. Let's first start by thinking about what data and what metrics you need, and how does that then tie into your theory of change. So loving this conversation, but I am looking at the time and thinking we should move on to the next stage of our conversation, where we start talking about equity-oriented capacity building. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. And so how is equity-oriented capacity building different from capacity building more generally? It is different because it centers equity as its purpose. And what's interesting to us as we've delved into the literature is there's actually a rich vein of literature that looks at capacity building for nonprofits and organizations. There's a rich vein of literature that looks at equity-oriented transformation, which is very much in the whole DEI space. There's actually very little that combines the two, right? And so when we think about equity-oriented capacity building, it is what kinds of capacity building will eventually lead to equitable outcomes for students, families, and communities. And as we think about that, I find it helpful to break it down into 4 broad buckets. So equity of access, so who has access? Representation, so whose points of view and identities and voices are represented in whatever is on offer, who has voice when it comes to decision making, and redistribution. So just recognizing that when you have a historical legacy of underinvestment in communities, you need to make up for it through redistribution in order to help them build the assets that they need, right? And so as we think about those 4 aspects, there are some practices that we can see that need to shift around capacity building. So I'm just going to kind of name some of these, and then we'll go back to the panel to just dig into these in more detail. So a lot of capacity building, to the point that Sherman was making earlier, is accessible only to a few people, to those who already have resources, right? And so a big shift we want to see is where it's available to all, especially grassroots organizations who are doing vital work in historically marginalized communities, right? The second is a focus on equity is limited to DEI-focused projects very often. Instead, we want to see how all kinds of capacity building starts explicitly focusing on equity of access, voice, representation, and outcomes in terms of what it changes, right? This whole conversation is about the third shift. How do you move from a funder-driven and deficit-oriented approach to something that's really mission-driven and based on what organizations need to serve communities, right? The fourth is, a lot of best practices, and this is to the point that Jen was making earlier on, is very homogenous. A few sets of folks, of providers who are delivering a few kinds of solutions that are often over-indexed on best practices developed based on a few organizations, right? Instead, if you look at the vast diversity of organizations that are doing really critical work in the field, we want to make sure the capacity building is responsive to their context and co-created with a diverse set of providers. And the last one, which I feel like all of us have spoken about a little bit, is how capacity building is often based on this very narrow understanding of capacity. Instead, we need to see it holistically, where it utilizes different modalities and is very integrated with organizational priorities. So we'll go ahead and stop sharing and take this back to our panel. So here's the question I have for the panel in general. As we think about capacity building that is equity oriented, what are some challenges and opportunities that you're all seeing that you think we should be paying attention to? Sherman, I'm going to call on you again. Just because, Sherman Whites is a great name.
I think that, I hope I'm answering your question, but I think that funders, when it comes to capacity building, I believe that I'm going to put myself in the we, even though I'm not currently at Philanthropy. I believe that we have to broaden our definition of what capacity building is. I was also nodding, it took me to a thought where looking at your screen, I think the first banner around access, we have what I call in this sector education celebrities, right? And the education celebrity doesn't need to really show the results because they already have the results from a previous body of work, or they have the right pedigree, whatever it is. And sometimes we overinvest in capacity building for those organizations, and then we underinvest for capacity building for the ones who are lesser known or startup. And those lesser known entities may actually have a stronger idea or a more innovative idea or an idea that's more proximate to communities, but they are oftentimes the ones that are struggling the most to actually get the capacity building support that they need. I would argue that they actually need more support than the people who are well established in the sector, but it doesn't work out that way. And I know there's the mindset of around the fact that funders invest in people, right? And if you have a body of work, you have a track record, you're more likely to get that investment. But at the same time, if we're actually trying to solve the problems we are purporting to solve, then we've got to be really creative and innovative around not only who we invest in, but and how proximate those people are to the communities that we're trying to serve, but also how we build the supports that we call capacity building around those individuals.
Yeah, I'm thinking, Sherman, about the whole idea of return on investment, right? Like sometimes we just look at the capacity that an organization has in absolute. We're not really looking at how much they were given in order to build that capacity. And sometimes when I look at grassroots organizations, I see how they've got so much and they've translated into something that's really huge and meaningful. And so I think that's a big question for all of us to keep chewing on and thinking about. What else is coming for others on the panel?
I can jump in. I'm thinking about, I don't know if it's a tension, but I'm thinking about the fact that there's capacity building work that is like kind of explicitly about improving, strengthening the organization itself, and capacity building work that is directly tied to kind of like the mission, like field facing work, because a lot of the capacity building support that we offered to our grantees in this strategy was about the work. It was about either doing continuous improvement or running a network or measurement or something like that. But we did have one pillar that was we called inclusive. My gosh, Leona, do you remember? We developed it together. Inclusive.
I think it was inclusive leaders in communities.
Yes, something like that. But that encompassed both for us DEI and also inclusive culture. Thank you, Rachel. Goodness, that encompassed both DEI work as well as engaging with communities and students and teachers. And so it was interesting for us because I think we maybe thought about the sort of DEI components as being the field facing, how they were working in communities, with schools, for example. But what we learned was that many of the organizations, probably all at some level, but just because the work is never done, really needed to do some internal work around diversity, equity, inclusion, even sort of, well, we saw it kind of running in parallel with, they didn't stop doing their field facing work in order to do that internal work, but that it was very important, especially, in 2020, midst of the pandemic, George Floyd's murder, that was a wake up call for a lot of folks about the fact that we need to be having different conversations within our organizations so that our work looks different in practice. And so I think that as we all think about this, it sounds like, when you named the capacities, Lucy, that Overdeck focuses on, that made me think those are kind of more like internal organizational sustainability or development kinds of things. So I think maybe we should not limit how we're thinking about capacity building to just the sort of internal things, because some of them might be more intrinsic to doing the work, but also to, I think actually we've kind of erred more on the side of only supporting capacity building as it relates to the programmatic outcomes and not as it relates to building the strength of the organization. So I think it's important that we sort of see it as a both and, not a competition, but that organizations may need both, and we need to kind of think about how we do that. So that's kind of what was coming up for me.
Yeah, it's interesting to me, Jen. You talk about how a lot of foundations have looked at capacity building as what's needed to accomplish the programmatic work. And I think now we are seeing a little bit of broadening out where it's like both what you need for your organizational development, the point that Lucy was making, but also what you need to survive and thrive in an environment and an ecosystem which is constantly shifting, the point that Dhivya was making, right? So it's kind of both looking more inwards, but also widening the aperture through which you're looking at the outside world and how the organization engages with it. Dhivya, you had a thought around grantees' orientation to equity itself when we had chatted previously. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that aspects of how equitable the grant the capacity building experiences and the co-creating is also both reliant on the funder's perspective and the grantees. And so, Jen, I think this is exactly the point. Like, if there is not a lot of capacity in general to support around like stakeholder engagement, community engagement, because that's not the orientation of the organization, then there has to be that capacity built. Alternatively, I've worked with a lot of organizations where they've got a really strong equity lens. And so they have a strong perspective on how they want to take on capacity building work, who they want to work with, what they require in terms of competencies of any partnerships, of any organizations they're working with. And so I think we see a lot of variation based on grantees' own orientation to how equity matters. And something else that was said that really resonates is like, we see a lot in mission and organizations focus on equitable outcomes, critical, important. And a lot of that comes out and manifests through equitable processes and equitable approaches. And so that part is really something that's come clear to me in my conversations with grantees. Another thing I'll add in relation to this, which is a little adjacent to the conversation of their orientation, but is rather like, I'm finding in terms of the funder perspective and how to approach these conversations with the mindset of equity is also trusting in the expertise of the grantee itself and their proximity to the communities that they're serving. And I mean, really, like, going back to the idea of assessing needs, oftentimes funders who have expertise in seeing broad trends and sees a lot of an array of organizational needs through their grantees has one set of expertise, but the grantee is an expert in their organization. They're an expert in their field. And so we may come to different sets of conclusions on the needs of how you would, what we need to build capacity in. And so what I've really relied on is conversation and deep partnership and trust building to manage through those differences. And also, again, the like being on the journey with them so that, you know, you're continuing to commit. And what I've often found too is there's difference of opinion. And then as you go on and you start to do the partnership and the work, you find that the root cause was actually something totally different. And we were both talking about symptoms, or the grantee had a better perspective on the root cause than I did because I was seeing it as a symptom. And so in terms of process, that like partnership, conversation, and trust is really critical to get over some of those challenges around differences in perspective.
So this is bringing up for me a question that Deborah, I think, mentioned, or you know, something that Deborah said was important to her in this conversation. So let's talk about the tension between this, given this power dynamic that exists between funders and grantees. And Deborah specifically talked about how she was looking for insights about the tension between asking grantees about what help they need and their desire to not appear vulnerable, which I think is a little bit of what you were, you know, starting to talk about, Dhivya. So would love to hear from all of you. How are you managing this tension or creating a space where grantees can feel completely, you know, open about their challenges, about, you know, all the stuff that's not working in their organization without this concern that they're going to get dinged at some point of time in the future?
I'm happy to jump in here. I think we see a lot of instances where these power dynamics can get in the way of that effective capacity building, and we really try to actively acknowledge those instances and avoid them as best we can. And so, like you were saying, Leona, if a foundation is putting too much pressure on a grantee to engage in certain supports or with specific providers, like Dhivya, you were saying, allowing grantees to have more choice in what types of supports and providers that they want to work with, or if a grantee feels like they just have to participate in engagement because it's offered by the funder or because it's offered for free, and believe that there's some sort of funding that's contingent on their participation. We try to avoid those instances by prioritizing offering capacity building support to our multi-year grantees. So those are organizations that we already have a funding relationship with through a pilot year, and we have a multi-year funding commitment in place so that we're able to rely on some of these trusting and transparent relationships that we currently already have with grantees and are already engaging in those trusting and more vulnerable back and forth conversations with the grantee and kind of coming to these checks and balances a little bit, so that we're able to ensure that we're truly meeting an authentic and pressing need for the organization, and not just as a funder inflicting our will. So for us, we offer grantees many opportunities throughout the entire capacity building process to both opt in and out of this approach. And more importantly, make sure that their grantees understand that in no way will they be penalized for choosing to not engage in any of our capacity building supports. We really work with them to try to understand from their perspective, where can we add this real value as the strategic advisor and with our technical assistance supports, and where we just actually need to get out of the way and let them do their work. One just example that we're of this balance of how hard to push these recommendations to, that's always the challenge. So we've had grantees say to us before in many engagements that if it weren't for this extra nudge that we gave them as a funder, they would not have gone in that specific direction or worked or gone down that path, but that they're incredibly thankful that we did give them that extra nudge, because it's dramatically changing their approach to their work. So this is just one example of where having that funder's perspective can have that strategic support that is helpful in a capacity building setting, but in no way the only example.
Sherman, Jen, other thoughts on what Lucy and Dhivya have shared?
I'll jump in. I hadn't thought about this before, but we partnered with Leona's organization Catalyst Ed to help structure and provide the sort of matchmaking between our grantees and technical assistance providers. And so I think that actually by us engaging with an external organization, a third party, if you will, that helped also reduce the pressure, because we sort of said initially, like, there are funds available you can access for these projects, and you will not only do your self-assessment process with this outside organization, essentially, you'll also work with them to scope your project. So I was really not involved. I mean, I think maybe like, we would talk about, oh, these people are doing a project in this area, and I'd be like, oh, that's great. But it was really, so I think maybe that actually, I never really thought about this way, but I think that probably helped to reduce that power dynamic too, because we weren't even kind of in the mix. We just kind of created the opportunity and we didn't require them to do it. And I think that once folks started taking advantage of the opportunity and then talking about it and sharing their, products and deliverables, others were like, oh, I want to do that too. And it sort of was like this positive contagion thing. So I think working with a partner organization in this case helped kind of reduce that sort of friction or tension that folks might have felt, especially early on, because we didn't, it takes time to build trust. And early on in those partnerships, we didn't necessarily have it. People were probably very nervous about doing the self-assessment because, if we say we're not good at this, what are they going to think? But I would always be like, well, you already got the grant. So like, we know that you're good enough at it. We just want to help you get better at it. So anyway, those are just some thoughts.
Okay, so I'm hearing a couple of things here, right? So one is about reducing the stakes. And so, Lucy, Jen, Dhivya, I think all of you have talked about how either because there's a long-term grant in progress or, there are just multiple opportunities, you're just reducing the stakes that come with folks saying, oh, this is what we think. And the other kind of tactic or strategy being having another entity have those conversations to create a little bit more of that space between the funder and the organization itself. Okay, so I'm going to just ask Sherman if he has any closing thoughts on this. And I see a question already in chat, which I'm super excited about. Thank you, Anthony. Other questions, please go ahead, put them into chat or into Q&A, and then we'll take them in just a second.
So I'll try to be quick. A couple of thoughts. Oftentimes, smaller organizations, the capacity that they could use the most from funders is support around research, evaluation, and learning. And oftentimes don't realize to ask for that type of capacity building support. That's the type of support that can actually buttress your case for the next grant, because you're actually you're speaking the language of philanthropy, and you're actually making a case of why your programming is strong and should continue to be supported. And then the last thing I'll say is working with Catalyst Ed. I've worked with Catalyst Ed as well, supporting capacity building for startup leaders of color, and working with support providers in other cities has been something that I don't know will ever come up in conversation. So I just bring it up. Like, if I live in Kansas City and my grantees are in Kansas City, I oftentimes try to get consultants to work with them to help them build their capacity, people who don't live in Kansas City. And it allows them to be more vulnerable. They feel like they can air their dirty laundry without hearing about it later. And that I found that to be a practice that we just kind of stumbled upon, but it's actually a very robust potential best practice, having people from outside of that person's normal ecosystem assist them with capacity building, because it allows them to be more vulnerable and share things that they may not share with people who are more local.
As a small town person, Sherman, that just totally resonated with me. I'm not telling anyone in my town what I'm up to. All right, so we see some questions here in chat. And so I'm going to take the first one from Anthony, who talks about how it's often a challenge to find technical assistance providers who are values aligned or have the cultural humility to effectively engage with organizations. And so what are experiences, and Jen, I might ask you this because you were the one who talked about the myth of how, about providers, right? So can you share a little bit about how you are seeing this and how you're managing this challenge? And then I can speak to a few thoughts as well.
Yeah, I would say that, I mean, when I came to the foundation and I knew that capacity building would be part of this community of practice, what I didn't want was, as I said at the top, anoint three organizations that are kind of well known to say, oh, they can, fill your needs soup to nuts. And that is part of kind of what led me to the partnership with Catalyst Ed, because I was aware that Catalyst Ed had a broad range of sort of experts and capacity building organizations, and kind of like a roster of experts that they could then, as our grantees developed their capacity building project ideas in partnership, they could then send it out to 5, 10, or 15, 20 organizations that had capacity in that specific area, that had skills in that specific area, and that group of organizations would be more diverse, they would be vetted, that I knew that as they put that group together, Catalyst Ed was thinking about, increasing the percent of orgs that were led by people of color, led by women, to really have a strong mix of folks. So I think that, and even as I've been seeing, and we're doing internally in the Gates Foundation, some work about our partner equity orientation as we think about the diversity of our partners, the folks we fund, but also our technical assistance partners, and lifting up the fact that there is a broad range of technical assistance partners. We don't have to always keep going back to the same folks. We can. So I feel like that ecosystem is growing and expanding. Sometimes it comes through personal networks. I know that, sometimes we'll say, we're looking for someone to help these folks do video or help these folks do something research. Who knows, people tapping into our peer groups, particularly for me, of other, philanthropists of color, other folks of color in the education space. So I do feel like the sort of roster of folks who are out there doing this work is growing and increasing. We have to increase their visibility and increase ways to get them on people's radar screens. But I do feel like that is something that's been shifting, particularly in the last 5 to 7 years. That's been my experience anyway.
Thank you, Jen. And I think, one of the things that's coming up for me here is the need to just question sometimes the idea of what is expertise. To the point that Sherman was making earlier, sometimes expertise is a coded word for people who went to certain kinds of colleges or worked in certain kinds of organizations. And when you juxtapose that definition against, providers who know what communities need and what grassroots organizations, what kind of context and constraints they work with, that can start looking like a really small universe. But the moment you start thinking about expertise more expansively and really thinking about what kinds of skills, perspectives, experiences are needed for a particular project to be successful, you suddenly start realizing that there's a whole lot more talent than exists, right? And you talk to especially leaders of color in education, everyone knows so many others who are hustling, either full-time as consultants or part-time. There are a lot of folks who have deep expertise, who are available to do the work, and who don't just have technical skills, but also that kind of knowledge of communities. And sometimes the challenge, to the point that Sherman was making earlier, is they don't have the resources needed to elevate their profile so that the world knows about them more broadly, right? So I think, organizations like Catalyst Ed, but there are others as well, are starting to build those networks, so that any organization can identify and readily work with folks who bring the right toolkit for a particular challenge. I am seeing a question here from Kwame about the rising costs affecting grant strategies, especially for organizations of color. So thoughts on this from the panel?
Because I'm an introvert, I already answered him in the chat.
That's a myth we all want to bust, Sherman. Is Sherman really an introvert or not? So Sherman's chat. Okay. So here's one thing that I can add here. We are seeing capacity building dollars come down, especially in this last year, right? And that's partly because organizations are often seeing that that their revenue forecasts are not as good as they would like it to be, and are kind of restricting their dollars for their staff, right? I think the myth, and Sherman, I might be speaking for you here, is that if you look at the dollars that are available in the sector for philanthropy, that's vast. And I think what we want to see is more and more funders who are, especially at times like this, when for economic reasons or the economy reasons, organizations have fewer resources to invest. That's when it would be great to see more funders investing into resources and into capacity building resources. But in terms of like just how we are seeing the dollars play out right now, so we do see capacity dollars getting pulled back. Okay, Stephanie, thank you for elevating that question from Q&A. So if there are funders who have tremendous TA providers that they want their grantees to work with and they want them to support, how can you make this happen while still honoring grantees agency?
I made a strong recommendation to one of my grantees about a partner to work with, and the project has gone not well. So I feel like if you have some strong providers, maybe throw them in the mix, and sort of say, here's 3, 5, whatever. I mean, they vetted multiple people, but I worry a little bit that sort of, my recommendation, they check out this one, kind of, I don't know if it tipped the scales at all, and I hope it didn't, but I fear it did. So I think that, that's a tough question. I think it's important to put them in the mix, but ultimately, trust that our grantee partners will be able to identify who's best to support their needs. That's kind of my feeling there.
Jen, that resonates, and I'll add, just from like a process or structure perspective, like what is the vetting criteria here? What are you looking at, and what is the grantees vetting process and criteria? We engage similarly, like they have our grantees have multiple conversations with the kind of set or list of providers we may provide. That also includes folks that they may want to bring in as well. And so we're just trying to, I think first is optional, always make it opt-in, opt-out. That's a really strong way to make this good. And then the second, or equitable, I should say, and one that allows for agency. And then the second is, this is two-way, like supporting the grantee in their vetting process. Like what are the right questions for them to ask to assess compatibility? And then also interrogating the funder, our own vetting process too. Is it good because they served another organization really well, but that organization is nothing like this organization? Like what are the connections you're making to do that? And so I think just looking at your criteria, taking a look and talking about it, and talking about the grantees one.
For us too, we sometimes will have the grantees who have worked with that organization and provider before talk to the grantee without us in the room, so they can have that like more open and honest conversation of, this did meet an authentic and pressing need. This provider was able to understand our cultural and societal context and be able to actually operate in those. So sometimes it's good to just get the grantees in the room to be able to talk to each other and get that feedback live too.
I'll chime in really quickly and just say, this is why it's such an advantage to work with a third party intermediary like a Catalyst Education, because oftentimes funders are the last people to realize that there's a power dynamic that exists. And it's like, oh, I just recommended, like, yeah, but you're holding the checkbook. So when you recommend, it's like my parents recommending something for me as a 10-year-old. They're actually telling me that I need to do it, right? Or else. And people start creating these narratives in their mind around the consequences of not following your lead, and then it may go down a road. Whereas you get a third party intermediary involved, you reduce that tension around that, and the grantee is more likely to say this isn't a good fit, or that third party intermediary working on the funder's behalf could also help coach the grantee on why this is a good fit. But it reduces that power dynamic and that tension.
I see Stephanie is in the room. And this has been such a great conversation. I feel like we can continue it for a while. But guess what? We are going to continue this conversation. So for those of you who are going to be at the Grantmakers for Education conference in Atlanta, we will be doing another session, which will be focused entirely on all of you. So we want all of you. It's called a Funder Lab. It's going to be an opportunity for folks there to speak with each other and learn from a much, much bigger group. And so we'll share out some details and resources as well. And then the second thing I'll say is we've put together a list of resources emerging from this conversation, but also some great reading for folks who are just curious about equity-oriented or transformational capacity building. And Stephanie will have some details on where folks can access that. Right, Stephanie?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Leona. And thank you again to all of you for joining us this afternoon. I saw in the chat when we first got started that folks were looking for inspiration, golden nuggets, insights, varying perspectives, and we definitely appreciate Sherman, Dhivya, Lucy, Jen, and Leona for the thoughtful insights and reflections that you shared today. Because we are at time, I'm just going to close with a couple of quick announcements and reminders. The video from this session will be available in about a week on the EdFunders YouTube channel. We'd love to stay connected to folks in our community, so please feel free to reach out to us to sign up for updates. We also have some additional programming coming up later in this month, field convening for the OST Impact Group next week, and a webinar on young adult perspectives on student-centered education on September 20th. And as Leona mentioned, the registration deadline for our annual conference in Atlanta is quickly approaching. So if you want to continue the conversation that started today in Atlanta in person with us, we would love for you to join us, and you can learn more at that bit.ly link to find out more about conference, to register and learn about all of the great sessions that we have planned. Thank you so much again, everyone, for joining us, and we hope that you have a great rest of your day.